Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at another webinar organized by the Center for Lebanese Studies around the current situation in Lebanon. I have the honor today of being joined by three key people who've been talking, researching, and involved in Lebanon. I would like to welcome Alain Bifani, the former Director General at the Ministry of Finance, and Jeremy, BBC Middle East Editor, and Emile, Senior Fellow at Middle East Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for joining us today. We meet again 1 month after our last webinar on Lebanon. The situation seems to be getting worse when we think it can get worse. It seems we're at the starting point of where everything began last year. We're back with the new government or old government, Saad al-Hariri, as if all of the efforts of the revolution and the uprising have been withered. Lebanon is crumbling more and more. Today I was at a meeting joined by a group of activists and organizations in Lebanon addressing the issue of social protection. And everyone is super scared about national security and SSF going bankrupt, which will mean the last, straw in terms of social protection will disappear. All people's investment will disappear, and basic provider of health also will disappear. So the situation is looking really dire. I'm going to start first with the economy because everyone wants to know what's going to happen economically. So Alain, I'm going to start with you. IMF is estimating real GDP will drop by 25% in 2020, and inflation, as we all know, is skyrocketing. Needless to talk about poverty line, etc. How do you read the situation now? And do you think there's anything happening, like behind the scenes concerning, attempts to save the economy, or what's happening, beside what we hear from the current Salemi, latest statement about the 10 billion that people have in their homes. Is there a policy or a strategy to fix the problem?
Thank you very much, Maha. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the Center for Lebanese Studies. Let me try to give a few figures first, and we can build on that. It is obviously the case that Lebanon is facing economic and financial bankruptcy. We have defaulted in March 2020, and there is still absolutely nothing that was done since this moment. We came up with a government plan that was very much welcomed by the international community, by the IMF, by all stakeholders. But internally, we managed to sabotage it for obvious reasons, and we can come back to that later on. Lebanon is also facing a currency crisis. It is very obvious. The Lebanese have already lost more than 80% of their purchasing power through the currency. And what we're seeing today is just unbelievable. We're witnessing a squeeze on the Lebanese pound availability. And this is used to stabilize the dollar, because obviously, if you don't find pounds, you cannot buy dollars. But at the same time, you are killing the economy if you don't provide it with its own currency. We are facing 6 exchange rates on the market. We still don't have capital controls, although it's been announced for more than a year. And banking resolution framework is still something that is out of reach. Not one asset quality review of any Lebanese bank has been done. And the funny part is that we hear officials talk about cryptocurrency to regain confidence. On top of this, we've seen, of course, the effect and the impact of COVID. We've seen the port explosion that has added a few billions to the losses. And GDP, after contracting by 6% in 2019, will probably contract by further 19.5% in 2020. We've seen soaring unemployment, hyperinflation at 120%, which is a very regressive tax. It is further increasing the inequalities in the Lebanese population, which is at the root of a lot of problems that Lebanon is facing. Poverty, as you rightly said, is about 50% now. And one has to be very careful about what happens when we run out of foreign exchange reserves on the poverty level. On the fiscal front, of course, the drop in revenue is extremely important. And we will likely have about 14.5% deficit at the end of the year. This accompanies severe restrictions on the capital account, and the commercial banks' net foreign assets are still deteriorating despite everything that was made to help them compensate for their losses at the expense of depositors and citizens. And the net liquidity is presently at about minus $3.2 billion. Imports have dropped by about 49%. And of course, this has improved the figure of the current account deficit, which will probably go toward the minus 6% of GDP, down from more than 20% in the previous years. But having said so, one should also analyze very carefully this new data. This means basically that poverty is spreading very quickly, that the purchasing power is still low, not compensated yet by local production, and we are heading toward the new normal that many players are hoping for in the economy. What I mean by the new normals is that we basically have two possibilities to get out of the crisis. Even from the higher end, which is the reform program, something that looks like the previous government's program. On top of that, probably IMF mobilization and a package of reforms. And the other possibility is to go from the low end, which is to witness a very impoverished country that all of a sudden will find a new normal, whereby those who created the losses will pretend that losses have disappeared from the balance sheets, obviously because these losses would have been shifted to depositors and to the citizens, further increasing inequalities in a dramatic manner. And this, of course, would be the nightmare scenario, but this is unfortunately what is being implemented as we speak by doing nothing, because doing nothing is precisely the third plan. We saw the government plan. We saw a plan that just doesn't fly, that was called the bank plan. And now we're seeing what the central bank is doing, which is basically letting the country find a new equilibrium at the lowest. The needs, we know the needs. Any new government will have to restructure the financial sector, restructure the Central Bank of Lebanon and audit it, finish the debt restructuring process and debt sustainability, embark in very deep monetary framework reform, go for the fiscal adjustment that has been long awaited, secure the social protection for the Lebanese, adopt growth-friendly reforms, and of course, make sure that public services are improved and that we're not going from one crisis to another in the public services. But will we have something like that? That's the big question. The big question is, are we going to be able to move toward or on the path of a reform agenda, or are we going to surrender to the fact that the main players in this game don't want change, and that we are going to witness a free fall for this country that will take it to, that will basically change its face?
Alain, can I ask you, you were inside the kitchen where things were being cooked. Who is really putting any, like who's preventing any reform from happening? I mean, the situation is dire for everyone, and for the various groups, for all the sectarian groups, for all the parties. But who is kind of like stopping any attempt for reform?
It's unfortunately very clear. You have two levels here of, if you want, people resisting very strongly reforms. The first level is obviously the existing political structure that is very insecure when it comes to witnessing any kind of change, any kind of, if you want, reform within the system, because it is about internal balances between them, because they're basically still fighting each other at the table of the Council of Ministers, and because they all fear that if this system whereby they are pumping the money from the citizens stop, then they will not find ways to continue to finance themselves. The second level is a more, excuse the word, interesting one. That is the level of those who have enormously benefited from the existing system financially. And when we were obviously writing the government plan, it was very clear that when we mentioned forensic audit, when we mentioned reversing the financial engineering results, when we mentioned having those who benefited most contribute most to the solution, we knew that it was war that was going to be waged against us. But those, in a nutshell, who are against are first the corrupt politicians. And when you talk about forensic audit, you are basically threatening them. Those who are the usual beneficiaries of this, lawless system of managing the financing and the monetary in the country. Most of them have benefited from billions of dollars in financial engineering. And third, those who are maybe in a position where they made their money in a legal manner, but they outrageously benefited from the way politics were pursued. And those are, for instance, the big shareholders of the banking sector. And once we decided to put on the table very clearly where the losses were lying, how much the central bank itself was in deep trouble, how much the banking sector had lost a lot, and how important it was to make sure that all of this is being tackled properly for the country to be able to start again and for the engines to be able to work, i.e. attracting dollars again into the economy, securing the financial channels, and allowing the institutions to be credible again. Of course, those three categories made sure that the whole issue would not fly. And we've seen that. We've seen the MPs, we've seen the bankers, we've seen the central bank, and we've seen part of the media that was pushed by them.
Thank you, Alain. Okay, it leaves us at a great point where we can come back to the new government, the new old. Is it so? Obviously, there's an agreement, a consensus amongst all the ruling elite in Lebanon that it's better to bury whatever crime they've done under the carpet and to just cover it up. But what are they hoping for? Like, how do they think they could get out of this? What are they counting on? What do you think, Emile, are the plans for the new government?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Just one quick general point is that, those of us who knew Lebanon and foreigners who visited and so on, when we landed in Beirut and walked around for a long time, we got the impression that Lebanon was the middle-income country, but Lebanon never deserved to be a middle-income country. I mean, its economic structure, its lack of exports, its a very weak regulatory frameworks and so on. I mean, we spent 2-3 decades lying to ourselves about what was happening. Of course, the wealthier, the more powerful had a better time than the others. But, when Riyad Salemi would get an award for Central Banker of the Year, we were happy about it. I mean, not necessarily me, but or you for that matter, but, it mattered. When things got tough, what would we say to ourselves and everyone else? Resilience. We're resilient, as if Lebanon escaped the laws of physics, of economics, and so on. And so the moment of reckoning, which we're going through right now, is extremely painful because it forces us to actually reflect not just on the corruption, the impunity of the past 30 years, but also on the illusions that we ourselves have cultivated about the self-image we had about Lebanon. And that's really painful. I think that we need to understand that there's something about the mindset that allowed the situation to fester. And it's extremely difficult even today. Obviously, those who took the streets and are screaming have certainly understood that and are adjusting to it. But there are other segments of the population, whether it's at the elite level or the more popular level, who still harbor the sense that, they'll come for us. We will be resilient again. It's in us. Somehow there is some magical formula out there that will put us on track. And the reality is that it's going to be very, very painful. Now, more to the politics of the moment. Yes, Saad Hariri is back as prime minister. It's been a month. He's trying to put the government together. I suspect, and I don't know what Jeremy and Alain think, that was actually the favorite option of almost everyone, even a year ago when Hariri resigned. The question was really about the shares of power in cabinet, some policy choices. But fundamentally, I suspect that this group, this clique of politicians we have, kind of agree on the fundamentals. That there's no desire to change the political system. There's a desire to protect their own financial economic interests, especially with the banks, and we see a much greater cooperation there. A desire to protect the central bank, and if you look at the declarations of politicians, that's quite clear. It's right now those criticizing the central bank for its lack of cooperation with the auditing firm are not the politicians, but the current caretaking government, or at least some individuals in that. But you don't see a broad-based clamor demanding that the central bank basically, shows us what happened in there, at least from at the elite level. I think the game has been quite dirty in the past year. Essentially, you have those sectarian and political petty interests that came into play, whether it's Hariri, whether it's Hezbollah and Amal, whether it's the President own and his own faction. But these factions are trying to figure out how to increase their share of a pie that's decreasing at the moment. As the economy shrinks, their own revenues, of course, they'll be fine, but their own revenues, their own ability to tap into the country's economic output is going to be affected. And so they need to protect whatever they can protect, and they need to seize more of whatever else is available. And I suspect, and I'm curious what Anna thinks about it, is that they're also positioning themselves for a potential fire sale of state assets down the road. Something that looks like Russia in the 90s. All analogies are problematic, and this one too. But this idea that to make up for the massive losses that the state and the central bank and others are going to incur, let's put whatever state assets remain on the block, and they will be underpriced, undervalued. There won't be many foreign investors wanting to come in. And so, let's start thinking about this option. Obviously, this would be disastrous for the country because Lebanese citizens would be paying 3 times for the economic follies of the political class. The first one by accumulating their massive debt and the interest on the debt and so on. The second time by losing their deposits, their lifestyles, etc. And by the third time, by essentially the robbing of the state to make up for those losses. And so I think it's a very difficult moment that we're going through. And you know, can Hariri essentially pull off something? I mean, look, the French initiative has been around for what, two months? President Macron came in September. And essentially, there were two things that need to happen. The formation of a government, and government of mission, as he says, you know, with a specific timetable and a roadmap, etc., and the beginning of the forensic auditing of the central bank. No one can say there's been much progress on that. And if you trust the reporting from Beirut, it's not as if this government will look like, you know, a government of new, fresh, competent figures who are able to take on the corrupt political and economic structure. If you follow the debate, it's about the shares between the various political actors, very little compromise, no sense of real outreach to, you know, the more competent Lebanese citizens around. And so it is in a way a step back from where Mustafa Adib was. I mean, if you believed the list of ministers that Mustafa Adib had put forward, I mean, you know, we can criticize, there was a lot out there, but at least there was a sense that perhaps something could change.
But why do you think,
I don't have that confidence.
Why do you think Adib's government was aborted before it was born, and Saad gets away, you know, informing the government? Is there, and here I think you've already started talking about the international dimension, but isn't it this, like, they're counting on someone, you know, no one can get away with how much, you know, Lebanese politicians are getting away without counting on someone. Are they counting on the French initiative? Are they counting on the American initiative? And Jeremy, if I can pull you into the discussion here, what do you think is happening now with these two different initiatives? You have the American initiative and you have the French initiative. And are they speaking to each other? Is it part of one game that's happening? And that is obviously giving this very failed, government the courage to even propose itself again after people have, went to the street to throw it out.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to be here today. It's quite an honor as a foreigner and as an outsider, friend of Lebanon. I visit regularly when I can. Those two initiatives seem to me, and the two countries seem to be working at cross purposes. It's a question of how those outside powers, through which prism they view Lebanon and the crisis in Lebanon. And, you know, from the American point of view, from the dying embers of the Trump administration, and goodness knows which directions he's going to be lashing out in his time left in office. But from America's point of view, it seemed very much through the prism of maximum pressure on Iran. So that is the thing, I think, that generates the kind of actions that they come out with. I think that Macron, when he went over not once but twice to Lebanon and was prepared to take a lead on it, I think from my point of view as an outsider, he made sensible suggestions about things that needed to be done, about the need for reform, about the need for a government that was going to do something. But as the last 20 minutes of discussion has shown, when you're in a crisis and the elite at the heart of that, the oligopoly that have run Lebanon for such a long time, even though they may compete against each other in all kinds of ways, the fact is that they have a shared interest in preserving a system that has helped them no end. And when they don't see the necessity, or even if they see a necessity of trying to do something, they feel essentially they can try and get away with what they already have, that they can ride this one out, that they're in a strong enough position to do, well, to maybe pay lip service to some kind of change, but not actually do anything. And to be honest, Lebanon's been in crises before, and that's more or less what they've done. Business as usual. Let's just tough it out, guys. This is all going to calm down. and there's the pandemic as well, which we can concentrate on a bit of that and blame the pandemic for all kinds of problems, but actually let's just hope that we don't have to change. Now, there seemed to be a consensus among many friends of Lebanon and many people within Lebanon, everybody I spoke to pretty much, when I was there in August, September, after the explosion, that really this time something had to be done. But it hasn't happened. That's because the same faces are trying to do the same sorts of things. So as far as, foreign powers are concerned, I mentioned through which prism do they view Lebanon. And I think from the point of view of European countries, they see it's always through in terms of stability and security. Lebanon is just across the water, and the European Union are not interested in anything that is going to generate any more refugees to start with. The Americans have their own set of beliefs and needs, as I said, which at the moment in the region under Trump revolve mostly about Iran. Israel's always there down south as well, and their preoccupations are well known. Don't have to remind any of you about that. So I think what history has shown is that real reform only comes from inside, from within. It can't be imposed. And while Lebanon needs a lot of help, and it needs that IMF bailout, clearly those countries don't want to put good money after bad and just prime the pump of a system that clearly doesn't work. So what are the alternatives? The alternatives that has to come from within. So what do we mean by that? Well, if the elite won't do it, more pressure on the streets. For lots of good reasons, that hasn't happened. And, as a friend and ally of Lebanon, I can't feel good at all about the next 6 months, about what may or may not happen, because of the fact that the crisis, as Alain mentioned so, sagely at the beginning of this, that devastating list of indicators right across the board. All the warning lights are red. They're not red, they've gone out of red, they're in critical. And until the leaders of the country think, well, hang on a minute, we're going to have to do something, then either somehow they go, or the crisis continues and gets worse.
You mentioned the bailout. When you were talking, I was thinking about that. Alain, do you think there's a chance that they will be bailed out? And Saad al-Hariri's attempt to bring this government again is basically, they can't change the whole system. Maybe there might be some concessions. Do you think they will bail them out?
The sad truth is that these people have been used to being bailed out for a very long time. It's not for the first time that Lebanon is going through ridiculous policies that are bringing the country down. In the past, already in the mid-90s, we were nearly bankrupt. And then before Paris II, we were nearly bankrupt. And Paris II was a conference whereby there was a bailout, and there was a bailout without conditionalities. The politicians in Lebanon were told by the international community at that time, go ahead and keep on doing what you're doing. We will be here to bail you out. And this is exactly what happened again at Paris III. Now, the idea when CEDR was prepared was precisely to try to avoid this lack of conditionality on one hand and a flow of money that is basically going to increase and magnify the weaknesses of the country. One has to be very cautious with the Lebanese economy when we talk about inflow of money. It is a fact that very high inflows of money have ruined Lebanon and not the other way around. It is not something good to always be relying on billions pouring in. We've seen the country lose its productivity. We've seen it lose its competitiveness. We've seen the labor market totally distorted because of that. Now, what is happening now, and I would like to pick up what Jeremy just said about the French initiative, is that it is clearly an initiative that is trying to find a solution to the fatigue that the international community has with Lebanon. So there is no more a natural reaction of bailing Lebanon out. Number two, there is COVID in the world. Everybody needs restructuring. Everybody needs money. And it's not going to be easy to explain that for the fourth or fifth time, the same corrupt political elite is searching for money and we have to support them because we want stability in Lebanon. We all know that this time it's not going to work like that. Already at Sadr, it wasn't working like that. And this is why the political elite in Lebanon didn't do anything to even start the implementation of the Sadr program. Number two, we are not anymore in the context of bailouts, even within the system. Within the system, there is no way we can imagine a bailout for the size of the losses that we have unveiled. And to answer Emile's point, because I think he was very, very right in mentioning it. Yes, there was an idea of an internal bailout, selling the state assets, giving them very simply to those who lost money once and who have been accumulating profits for 3 decades before, just as if whatever was the property of the Lebanese citizens was to be given away all the time. We already saw the expropriation of Lebanese citizens and stealing their wealth at the beginning of the 90s. And we saw it throughout the process, and it would be really catastrophic to see it happen once again. And by the way, the state assets are not only the public enterprises that are not working properly, it's not only the real estate, it's also the gold. Keep this in mind. So bailing the system out, yes, but who's going to bail it out? Today, the real question, and I would like also to come back to a point that was mentioned by Jeremy. Yes, the alternatives have to come from within. It's totally impossible to imagine that the rest of the world in a situation like that is going to all of a sudden decide that despite everything that happened, despite the billions of dollars that are deposited in foreign countries in their banks, obviously the property of Lebanese PEPs, that all of a sudden the foreign taxpayers are going to come back and bail out this system. So in 2 words, and no, maybe before, just 2 words about the French initiative and why I think that it was basically taking into consideration this impossibility. In my personal view, and I may be wrong, what the French tried to do is the following. They said, on one hand, we don't see any alternative to the clique that is around, an alternative that can immediately take over and that we can push, provided that we have the strength to do that. But at the same time, we know that if we deal with the old gang, the international community is not willing to continue to act positively toward these people. So we have to find a way in between, which is to come up with an executive body that looks like something new, while keeping the old gang in control from parliament and elsewhere, which was smart and which could have brought the country to at least a few success stories, for instance, in a few public services and so on, and allow the system to start moving. It doesn't seem to be working for the time being. We shouldn't hope that it doesn't work because there is no other initiative on the table for now. But let's say that resistance is still extremely high. What should happen from within is that the political forces have to be put in front of one straight reality. If they don't allow any kind of change to happen, the whole country is going to collapse. Of course, the citizens are going to pay a very high price. And nothing matters to the elite except when it touches them directly. The international community has always been wrong by telling them, if you don't do this, you will see how bad it will be for Lebanon. They don't care. The only thing they care about is what touches them directly. And you can, go back to the first visit of President Macron when he said, maybe there will be sanctions. Immediately, there has been positive reactions across the spectrum. And when they dropped it, all of a sudden, it became impossible to form a government. Now, I'm not saying that sanctions are the only element, but I'm saying that it has to be very clear from within and from outside that we shouldn't rely on how sensitive these people are to the well-being of Lebanon as a whole. It's about touching their own interests, putting this at stake, and making sure that they understand that if the whole situation doesn't improve, their own situation is going to deteriorate.
Thank you, Alain. I'm going to go to you, Emile. Many external powers and international parties interfering, and despite the deteriorating situation, we don't see lots of mobilization in the streets. What do you think is happening? And what do you think what strategies are left for the opposition to really try to change the game, or to seize more power, or to hold the government accountable? How would you explain the apathy that we see now, and what strategies they have?
Well, let me first disagree with your premise. I don't think that there are that many countries interfering and so on. And that's one of the problems I think that Lebanon is facing. We got lazy. We were a spoiled child for decades. We wanted international attention. We cultivated. We loved it when George W. Bush was pronouncing the word Lebanon twice or three times a day, when Chirac hugged us, when King Abdullah of Saudi was always asking about it. Well, that world is gone. The Middle East has changed. Lebanon may have been in the past the number 3 issue on the regional agenda. Now it's number 17 or 23 for all I know. When Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq are burning, when the issues are just absolutely massive and so on. And that's part of the problem, is that psychologically, I think the Lebanese, whether it's the politicians or the citizens, don't realize that the country is much less important now, and we have only a few chances to get it right. So when President Macron puts his prestige on the line and invests political capital in that, well, that's probably the Western leader who will want to take a risk like this one. There are not that many. Saudi Arabia, well, the Saudis have essentially written off that part of the region. Of course, they keep an eye on it, but it's not as if they're massively invested. If you are in Riyadh right now, you wonder, those decades of political capital and money and so on that you've invested in Lebanon, what did they amount to when the most powerful Lebanese political faction is supporting a direct enemy in a war that's happening, and Lebanon can do nothing about it? The mindset in the region and beyond has changed. Lebanon is no longer that important. There's only a few people who care about it for understandable reasons, including in the EU, as Jeremy says. But we shouldn't give ourselves too much importance. I hope that this will help actually Lebanese citizens and politicians recalibrate and adjust and realize that, okay, the time where we had a good time in Western and Arab capitals has ended, and so it's time to work on domestic issues. Now, like you and others, we were quite excited, enthusiastic about what happened a year ago, the protest movement. It did start well. I think for the first time there was an agreement on the diagnosis of the situation. There was a wholesale rejection of the political system. There was an understanding of how the economic system had actually compounded all the existing problems. But in reality, time was always on the side of the political elite. They could outweigh, they could outplay the protest movement. And of course, with the economic situation getting worse, a lot of people started focusing on survival, and survival means making a lot of compromises. Then you had the coronavirus pandemic, which essentially, shut down also activity and changed the plans of the protesters. And, was a major constraint on mobilization. And then you had the port explosion, which should have been a galvanizing moment because of the clear consequences of the impunity and the incompetence and the negligence and mismanagement of the state. But all these factors have a cumulative effect. I think a lot of people now are essentially dejected. There is a sense that, look, the nomination of Saad Hariri as prime minister again is lived by many as an insult. But that's not, that's how people around me, activists that I talk to and so on, live it. It is a slap in the face. But when you ask, okay, what can you do about it? What are the mechanisms? What are the activist coalitions that have been put together? Like, how do you realize there's not much. And as Alain said, Macron came to Lebanon, probably well-intentioned. He made a number of mistakes in the process, but overall it was a positive message. But he left Lebanon in August and September thinking, the solution is not going to come from the civil society and the protesters. There's no agreement on the platform. They struggle to put names forward. They have a hard time explaining what this new government would look like. And they're divided. They're divided between those who want to focus on sovereignty or on reform. Those who want IMF and those who don't want IMF. Among protesters, this is a discussion still going on. So, like many revolutions, or at least revolutionary movements, there are internal contradictions that play out and that weaken the movement. And that's where we are. Very sadly, and I recommend that you read a piece that was published in Synapse, an excellent research group in Beirut. Very sadly, the political class still has enough popular support. And I suspect that as things get worse in Lebanon, there's a lot of people who will just be fence-sitters. They will focus on survival. It will be painful, but it will be very difficult for them to mobilize politically.
Okay, so how are we going to get out of this, if we're ever going to get out of it? What do you think? Is this going to last for another 5 years? What would be some of the kind of practical steps you would take to move forward and get out? If you had the power to do this, what would be the reform steps that you would? And please, I'm speaking to both Emile and Alain, Jeremy. Please also feel free to jump in.
Well, if I can, sorry.
Go ahead, Emile. Go ahead.
I think we shouldn't pretend that there is an option in the short term besides, the French initiative and a recourse to the IMF. There's no other option. Alain has clearly told us what the so-called 3 options are, and 2 of them are not really options. They're basically a total freefall in the country. The only option at this point, we need to get back on the financial markets. We need to open up the economy. This is essential. That nothing is as important as that.
But will Saad Hariri do this? Is this part of his plan, you think?
I suspect that this was part of his pitch to the French and the others. Say, look, I am still the foremost leader. I have all other, sadly in this country, Sunni candidates for the prime ministership have underperformed. They haven't been able to rally enough support. I can make deals with Hezbollah. I can make deals with ON and so on. And relatively, my position today as Saad Hariri is stronger than it was before, which is a very weird proposition, but still. So, and he's a recognizable name for the Americans, for the Saudis, for the Germans, for the French, for the Brits, for the Japanese, and so on. Those that we would be counting on. But I certainly don't have any faith that he would come with a comprehensive reform agenda. But if in the short term his hands are tied by the French initiative and by the IMF, that's still something we can work with in the hope that there could be elections under a better electoral law, greater organization of political forces that are, have a reformist agenda, and see. I mean, it may end up being a total dud. I mean, it's very possible that the traditional political parties will win those elections again. I suspect this is the likely scenario. I don't expect a massive, wave of reformists. If they gain 20% of the seats, which won't be enough to really change policy, but that's, that would be great and, good enough. And it's quite tragic. We're not talking about the scenario where they seize 40, 50, or 60% of the seats in parliament to force the kind of change that we want.
Alain, what do you think would be some of the steps that could happen? Sorry, Jeremy, I'll come back to you in a just.
I mean, first on the upcoming government, if it comes, I think that if Mr. Hariri is coming back, it is precisely because he doesn't bring a comprehensive reform agenda. That is exactly what is requested by the political elite that we were talking about. What matters is to try to earn as much time as possible without any change. And this, we know that it's going to be at the expense of the Lebanese citizens. It is unfortunately the case that now the regime is working against the Lebanese interests on a daily basis. Number two, Emile mentioned deals, and I think that that's unfortunately the right word, and I'll tell you why it scares me. When you have a government like that is here in the most difficult circumstances, that is going to be faced by social, economic, financial, political issues all the time, the appetite for deals, small, sometimes counterproductive deals, is going to be big. It's going to be possible to go and sell the issue of the maritime borders, for instance, at any rate. It's going to be possible to give the port of Beirut at the lowest rate. It's going to be possible to start again the public services stories like waste management and so on, well, to please whomever can bring anything to support its position. But more importantly, it could be tempted by a minor deal, for instance, with the IMF and the international community, if they play the game. And that would be, against any ridiculous small set of reforms, like the ones we used to see before producing the comprehensive reform agenda of the previous government. That could work against like a few hundred millions to be lended to Lebanon for some time. And once again, depleting all our resources and bringing Lebanon down further, but only gaining more time. That's one thing that we should try to avoid at any rate. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about a systemic issue. It is not about introducing 2, 3, 4 major reforms. It's about, let's face it, changing the system. And to be able to change the system, well, how does this work usually? You have revolutions, bloody revolutions. Well, it doesn't seem that it is very possible in a country like Lebanon. We've seen how much violence from the other side was used against demonstrators. You can imagine a military coup. It's not in the habits of the country and the institution. You can imagine all of a sudden a team coming into the executive body and, some sort of a cabinet de salut public, that will force the system to change, to introduce reforms. And you can imagine elections. But I agree very much with Emile. If we have elections sometime soon, it's going to be the same again. And clearly, one has to give enough chance to a different executive body that would be able to secure a few successes, to already show and ascertain the fact that Lebanon is able to introduce reforms. although not at the, at the biggest. And let's not forget that a lot of the reforms that we're talking about have direct implications for the external world, whether we're talking about the Lebanese diaspora or whether we're talking about people who dealt with Lebanon one way or another. The restructuring of the banking sector will allow the Lebanese diaspora to find back what is left of its money in the Lebanese banks. It's the first time that diaspora is suffering so much from a crisis in Lebanon. We have to keep in mind that the debt restructuring, well, part of it is to be done with international agencies and institutions. All of this is a serious leverage that can be used to force some sort of a change within the system, and clearly to show that things can be done differently. More than that, in the immediate, unfortunately, I don't see a lot of, a margin for that.
Jeremy, sorry, again, back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to really elaborate on a couple of things that the other our eminent friends have been saying here. And it's, right, so if we're agreed that Lebanon has a really major systemic problem, that absolutely at the center, at the root of power, it needs to be changed. So how does that happen? Well, internationally, Macron was the only real game in town. I think that's quite clear. And let us not forget that any leader only has a certain amount of bandwidth. And there's an awful lot on Macron's agenda at the moment. And I suspect Lebanon has slipped right down it. You look at all the domestic issues that they're facing in France at the moment. That's the first thing. It is almost exactly 10 years since Mr. Bouazizi set fire to himself in Tunisia, setting off that, extraordinary period. But with the exception probably of Tunisia itself, popular protest has not translated into a constructive new setup somewhere, making that connection. Now, Lebanon's civil society was absolutely admirable at the time of the explosion. It was, remarkable and moving to see people helping others in the streets. But translating that into a political plan of action, getting coherent positions from protesters, from people who consider that Lebanon had a revolution. I found a lot of people in Lebanon say to me, "Oh yeah, we've had a revolution, but we ran into problems. There was the pandemic, and it's not a revolution, guys. I'm sorry if that's what happens. The intentions were good, but it's not that. So how do you do it? And I know we've got time issues right now, but I think as Alain was saying earlier on, try to find ways of making these guys realize that they're going to get hurt. It isn't simply the ordinary people in the country who they just see from the windows of their limousines who are going to take the pain. If that sort of leverage, that's perhaps one way of trying to create leverage and change without the other option, massive impoverishment, potential destabilization on local levels with law and order. Let's not forget that sadly there are an awful lot of guns in Lebanon. Yeah, it's a real challenge, but maybe that's the first beginning. Try and just say to these people, you change or else.
Okay, we have, thank you, Jeremy. We have 6 minutes left and we can't but talk about Maritime Talks. Suddenly, amid the crisis and the French intervention, we suddenly get Berry on the TV saying that he is going to be having direct talks with Israel and with the support of the US, while the US is also imposing sanctions. on Berry politicians and now on Basel. What do you think is happening there? Because we're all like a bit lost. And yesterday, Nasrallah said, "Oh no, this is not a. No one should think it's a peace treaty or anything like this." What do you think has happened? In brief, if each of you can, in a couple of minutes. Jeremy, do you want to start, and then we move to Alain and then Emile? Oh.
You hear me all right?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, things are breaking up a bit at my end here. I think it's a sign. Maybe it's as a result of the depth of the crisis and the feeling that something needs to be done that isn't too fundamental in terms of their interest. It's something, it's something that can be held up. Look what we're doing. We are actually facing up with these troublesome guys down south, and we're trying to come up with something coherent. It's something to hold up, which doesn't, longer term, of course, it's an issue that has to be sorted. But I think that in the short term, it buys some time.
Okay, so you don't think there are any financial gains that are going to come out of it?
Look, I'm sure there probably are. I mean, I'm no expert on the financial side of things, so I don't feel qualified to make a judgment on that. And yeah, there's potentially for people always have an eye on the pocketbook issues.
Alain, over to you.
Well, very briefly, first, it's very clear that now it's the only topic on the table. There has to be a topic, and this is one that was basically filling the emptiness. The file has been there for quite some time, and it was meant to happen at one time, but I think that the Lebanese chose the wrong timing to if you want, restart the negotiations, because it fell right after the sanctions imposed by the US administration. And this looked like more, coming to the table after the sanctions. And it looked like when the French initiative was taking place, we did not react positively to a positive move, but we immediately reacted to a negative move. Number three, I don't think that it has anything to do with financing, money, petroleum assets, or anything like that. In any case, all of this is going to take a very, very long time. It is not a question of giving the country any kind of resources for now, but it is very important in the local game of the policymakers in Lebanon. It's important because based on that, they can buy time from their own base. They are basically telling their people, see, there is something at the end of the tunnel. It's no problem if we're not doing anything for now. We have the possibility of becoming a very resource-rich country that would sort out the issue. So just continue to take the bad things and keep hoping. That's yet one other way of buying time in a very ugly manner.
Thank you, Alain. We'll finish with you, Emile.
Well, I mean, I share the cynicism of the cynical takes of Jeremy and Alain on this. I mean, it's worth remembering that 10 years ago, a bit over 10 years ago, there was a massive ad campaign in Lebanon that promised us free education, free healthcare, amazing roads, great environment, and so on. Once oil and gas had been found, and so on. I mean, look, one, it's a distraction from the reality. And, besides producing oil or gas, if there's any, there are very complicated issues like how do we export? How do you convince companies to invest in Lebanon in large, oil facilities after the explosion of the port of Beirut, which shows you the criminal negligence of the state? I mean, the political risk of Lebanon has increased massively. Which insurance company is going to take seriously, a $1 billion investment in this? So we have to be very careful about this. It's a distraction. It allows, a few politicians to pretend to play well. I mean, as Alain said, with the others. I mean, this is a typical issue that should have been resolved quite easily 10 years ago when the Americans, were prepared to do that, the Hof plan at the time. And it was entirely on the Lebanese, the failure of those early efforts. And we have to be honest about it. None of this was going to lead to any kind of normalization or peace accord with Israel. There's a broad consensus in Lebanon that this shouldn't happen or anytime soon. And that was, a very narrow point that needed to be resolved. But again, it's yet another illustration of the way that serious policy issues are dealt with, in the most complacent and sometimes dismissive manner by the political class. This shouldn't be this big issue. I mean, and we would have gotten, goodwill and a better profile. Not that I believe that there is much money in this anyway, but if we had solved it on merits some time ago, whereas now we're doing it because we're in the deepest possible hole, and we want to alleviate pressure in any way we can. It just speaks to the incompetence and the impunity of this political class. And sadly, it is the most expected thing at the same time. I mean, that's the sad part in Lebanon, is that you cannot but expect this kind of calculation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emile. So thank you very much for this very engaging discussion. Unfortunately, the picture looks bleak. But I think more than any time before, I feel it's time for Lebanese now, for us to, more than any time before, to depend on ourselves and to really aim for a change. I don't know what kind of a change. I do still think, Emile, international, powers do interfere. And, we have Iran, we have Russia, we have lots of parties that are also making a difference, and making it also hard for the civil society or local movements to also make a difference. But I think maybe it's more than any time before we need to organize and to get better at introducing change, hopefully. Thank you very much. We already 2 minutes past 5. Thank you again, Emile, Alain, Jeremy, and we will continue this discussion over, the next few months. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.